Welcome back. It is time for our second and last performer. Portraying Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is Marvin Jefferson. To paint the monologue for you, we are traveling through time again. It is Sunday morning, April 30th, 1967. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will be giving his speech regarding his opposition to the Vietnam War at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. However, prior to his sermon, he has agreed to be interviewed. By whom and what will the interview be about? Let's listen.
I don't normally have an interview before a sermon, but you are from Morehouse. And you are going to be writing for the Maroon Tiger, Mr. Cook, is it? All right. Well, have a seat, Mr. Cook. Yes, I wrote for the Maroon Tiger when I was in 1947. I don't remember what I wrote, but I do remember I wrote for it. And hopefully I'm giving this interview because, well, as you know, I haven't been getting a lot of good news in the press lately. Now, we spoke the other day, and I wrote down some of the questions that you had for me. And the title of the article is The Political and Spiritual Journey of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you have as your first question, oh, by the way, do you have your tape recorder? Okay, good, because I may need you to edit some things. Not because I believe in censorship, but I just want to stay focused on the issue. Your first question is, how did I arrive here? Now, you being from Morehouse, I'm assuming you mean how did I arrive here regarding my views about economic justice and my views about the Vietnam War. Because just based on face value, how did I arrive here? Well, one could say I arrived here by car. But because you are from Morehouse, I'm assuming you mean the former, not the latter. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk too much about the economic issue. Hopefully we'll talk on the phone tomorrow. And in regard to Vietnam, hopefully you'll stay for the sermon, and in that way, it'll answer all the questions you have. But you do have a question here that's very important that I do want to answer. And how has this journey impacted my faith? That's a good question. January 27th, 1956. Now, I realize that date means nothing to you, but it means a great deal to me. You see, prior to that date, and maybe prior to December the 1st, 1955, which date you should know, my life was like a great big Christmas present ready to be opened up. As you know, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, here, in 1929, and my father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., and my mother, Alberta Williams King, my older sister, Christine, my younger brother, A.D., Alfred Daniel, and my grandmother, Williams. We all lived on Auburn Avenue here, 501 Auburn Avenue, Sweet Auburn. And it was a loving, very supportive household. I suppose that's why love is something that is very tangible to me, because my household was so loving and so supportive. Now, my mother was very sweet-natured. She was a very sweet-natured woman, very loving woman, would always tell me to make sure that I know that I'm just as good as anyone else. And I suppose I took on some of her characteristics. And my father, he could be very blunt, very curt. He has this way of speaking to people that me and my sister Christine would marvel at, because we never knew how he was able to speak to people in this way and there not be any repercussions. I mean, he would speak to black and white in this way. I remember when I was very young, I was riding with him. I was in the back seat of the car, and he was driving, of course. And I believe he ran a stop sign. And the white police officer came up to him and said, "Boy, don't you know you ran that stop sign?" And my father immediately pointed back at me and said, "There's a boy. I'm a man, I'm Reverend King, and if you continue to speak to me in this way, I'll pretend you have nothing to say." Well, the police officer was so flustered, he hurriedly wrote the ticket and gave it to my father. This is how my father was. This is how he dealt with people. And he had a deep hatred of segregation, and I know I carry that in my personality. Now, my father was also the disciplinarian of the family. He must have given me whippings until I was about, oh, I don't know, 15 years old. Now, one day, one of these events took place, and my father was whipping me, and he said, "Boy, I'm going to beat you till you become somebody." Now, when he said that, my friend Howard, who lived next door, was looking at this, and when he said that, my friend Howard just broke up laughing. And my father stopped dealing with me and then turned to Howard and said, "Oh, you thought that was funny?" And then Howard knew enough to say, "Well, no, sir." He said, "You know what I'm trying to tell this boy? I'm trying to tell him I'm going to beat him till he becomes somebody. If you keep on laughing, I'm going to help you to become somebody." Now, interestingly enough, I believe my father called up Howard's parents and had Howard sent over, I suppose, to teach him how to become somebody. Now, what happened to Howard? Oh, Howard became the top-ranking Negro of the police force in Atlanta, Georgia. I suppose my father's helped him to become somebody. My family did a great deal in sheltering me from the harsher aspects of segregation. But if you are a Negro child growing up in the South, eventually segregation is going to come to your door, and my situation was no different. There were two times that were very, very memorable to me. And one, I was very young, and there was this young white boy who I would always play with. Now, of course, we were living in segregation, but his parents owned a store which was right across the street from our home. And so they would bring him along, and so we would come out and play. And he had a good time. Very dear friend of mine. And so one day I went to his home, and his mother was standing there. And when I asked where was he, she said, "Well, I'm not allowing you to play with my son anymore." And I said, "Well, why?" She said, "Well, because you're colored, and I don't want my son playing with colored children. Go on your way." I was very disturbed by that. And I went home, and I told my parents, and they had this look in their eyes, looking at each other, and then they had this long conversation with me, the conversation many Negro parents have had regarding segregation and slavery. And my mother emphatically telling me that, "Just remember, you're just as good as anyone else, and don't let anyone tell you different." But already you could see I could feel that unconscious bitterness, that unconscious hatred of all white people. They also told me that we were Christians, and of course, as a Christian, we had to love our white brethren, not love what they did, but love them despite what they did, and I couldn't understand that. I could not understand how I could love someone who had no love for me. I myself had this uncomfortable conversation. You see, my oldest daughter, Yolanda, always wanted to go to Funtown. And we would see the billboards on the highways, or see the ads on TV, and every time they would come on, she would say, "Daddy, I want to go to Funtown. I want to go to Funtown." And me and Mrs. King would oftentimes just look at each other and say nothing, or we would pleasantly change the conversation. Well, one day it came on television, and my daughter was very emphatic. "I want to go to Funtown, Daddy. Why can't I go to Funtown?" You know, Mr. Cook, I've spoken eloquently about a lot of things, but I found myself stuttering and stammering, trying to explain to my baby why she could not go to Funtown. You see, sweetheart, you're not able to go to Funtown because you are a Negro child, and they do not allow Negro children to go to Funtown. But I promise you, as your father, I will do everything I can to ensure that one day you and other Negro children will get to Funtown. And I can already see the clouds of inferiority moving in her little mental sky. It's a very painful, painful conversation. Now, Mr. Cook, you know I've been to jail many times. And this one time, they allowed me to, speak to my wife. And my wife put my daughter Yolanda on the phone. And she said, "Daddy, how come you have to go to jail so much?" And I said, "Well, sweetheart, the reason why Daddy's in jail is to ensure that you and other Negro children will get to Funtown." And she said, "Well, Daddy, you stay in jail as long as you have to. until I get to Funtown. That's a true story. There was another event that took place when I was a little older. I was in high school, my last year of high school, and I was entered into an oratorical contest. We were in Dublin, Georgia, and I came in second place. Now, I wanted to be first place, of course, but second place was pretty good, and I felt good about myself. Now, we were heading back on the bus. Now, of course, you know, Mr. Cook, about the buses, segregation, and how you had the white folks in the front and the black folks in the back, and as the bus got full, if more white people came on, then the black people had to stand up to allow them to have seats. Well, this started happening on this bus, and I refused to move. And the bus driver turned to me and started cursing at me, calling me names, and I still refused. I had won an oratorical contest. I was just as good as anyone else. Why do I need to stand up? And between my teacher emphatically asking me to stand up and this man cursing at me, I eventually stood up in the back, in the aisles, 90 miles, all the way to Atlanta, Georgia. It was the angriest I'd ever been. Well, despite those and other instances, my family was wonderful in sheltering me from the harsher aspects of segregation. I went to Morehouse College when I was 15. I graduated in 48. I went to Crozer Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and graduated from there. And then I went to Boston University School of Theology, and I got my PhD in 1955. I got married in 1953. I got my first pastorship at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1954. And it seemed as if my life was a great big Christmas present. But three things happened that changed all of that. One was in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, and the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional as it related to education, but we all knew that it meant that segregation was unconstitutional, period. And it was only a matter of time before segregation was dead, and we were quite excited about that. In 1955, the evil murder of Emmett Till galvanized Negroes all over the country. And of course, on December the 1st, 1955, a brave woman by the name of Rosa Parks took a stand by sitting down, and she started a movement. And that movement was called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I was chosen to be president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. I didn't seek it. I didn't ask for it. But it was something I had to choose. I had to take, mind you. Now, you know, when you are chosen to be a leader or a spokesperson or a symbol, oftentimes television and newspapers will want to hear what you have to say, and that's all well and good, but there's another side to being a leader, a dark side. Now, during the first few weeks of the boycott, things were going well, but after the white folks knew that we meant business, they started doing some nasty things. And one of the things they started doing was arresting anybody and everybody who had anything to do with the boycott. And I was arrested on January 26, 1956, for traveling 30 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, something like that. In any case, they arrested me and they put me in the back seat of the car. Now, I thought they were going to take me immediately downtown to the Montgomery City Jail. But they started driving around quite a bit, and I started getting very nervous. And I thought to myself, well, these are men of goodwill. They are lawmen. Certainly they won't allow anything bad to happen to me. And then another thought came to me and said, well, they may not allow anything bad to happen to me with each other, but they may certainly put me in the hands of someone who will allow something bad to happen to me. And I became very, very anxious. And in the gloaming, I saw this sign saying, Montgomery City Jail. You know, that was the happiest I'd ever seen a jail sign in all my life. And they put me into a segregated cell, of course, and with all these other black men. And they started recognizing me. And I started hearing, Dr. King, how did you get here? And Dr. King, why would they arrest you? And this started turning into, Dr. King, I was arrested unjustly. And Dr. King, they put me in here under false pretenses. And Dr. King, can you get me out? And Dr. King, can you do this? And Dr. King, can you do that? And I said, fellas, before Dr. King could do anything for anybody, first Dr. King had to get out of jail. And they laughed. I remember when my bail was posted, I remember hearing one of them say, "Don't forget about us, Dr. King." And I didn't. That was the first time I was arrested. And it was a galvanizing experience for me. And so the next night, January 27th, 1956, I had come home late. I was in meetings all day, and I just merely crawled into the bed. Now, we had been receiving phone calls, 30 to 40 a day, phone calls and letters saying the most evil, vile, and nasty things. And so, as soon as I crawled into the bed, the phone rang. And I picked it up, and on the other end was an evil voice. And it said, in essence, "Nigger, we're tired of you and your mess now. If you don't leave town in 3 days, I'm going to blow your brains out and blow up your home." That voice cut through me, Mr. Cook, like a knife. I couldn't sleep. I got up and stood in the doorway looking at my child, who was just born a little over a month ago. And she was the light of my life, and every time I would come in, I would see her little smile. And I realized that she could be taken away from me at any moment. And then I looked at my loving and devoted wife, and I realized that I could be taken away from her, or she could be taken away from me, and I couldn't take it. I had to get up, and I walked into the kitchen, and I warmed up some coffee and poured me some, thinking that somehow coffee would bring me some relief. I started thinking about many things, Mr. Cook. I started thinking about my university days, and the theological and philosophical reasons for the existence of sin and evil in the world, thinking that somehow this would help me to cope with this situation, but it didn't. I couldn't call on my daddy now. He was 175 miles away. I couldn't call on Mama now. I had to call on that somebody that my father used to tell me about that could make a way out of no way. You see, religion for me, Mr. Cook, was something inherited. It was something I was born into. It was not something that came about through hard-won faith, and I had to find a way to make God real for myself. So I prayed over that cup of coffee. I prayed loud that night. Lord, I'm down here. I'm trying to do right. I believe I'm right. But Lord, I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. I'm becoming weak. And I can't let the people who chose me to be their leader to see me as weak, because they may become weak. I'm at the end of my rope. God, I literally do not know what to do. And Mr. Cook, a voice from within spoke to me as loudly as I'm speaking to you and said, "Martin Luther, you stand up. You stand up for truth. You stand up for justice. You stand up for righteousness. And lo, I will be with you to the end of the earth. You stand up for truth, and I will never leave you alone. No, never alone. I will never leave you. I will never leave you alone." And I knew that was Jesus speaking to me, telling me to still fight on. And it felt as if a burden was lifted off of me. And I knew that regardless of whatever happened, I knew that God would be with me. Now, 3 days later, I was in a church, and I saw a lot of commotion in the back. And eventually, I asked what was going on, and someone came up to me and said, "Martin, your home was bombed." And I said, "Well, is Coretta and Yolanda all right?" They said, "Well, we're trying to find that out." So I hurriedly left, still calm based on what happened to me 3 days ago. And as I was coming to the house, I saw all these black people, wave upon wave of black people coming, and they had broken bottles and sticks and pipes. Some of them had guns. And I ran up the stairs, and I saw my wife and my child, and I hugged them, and I thanked God that it was safe. And then the city father came to the door and said, "You know, there's going to be a riot out here. You better come out here and say something." So I went out, and I put my hand up and said, "My wife and my child are all right. I'm all right. I want all of you who have guns and weapons, please take them home. This movement is God's movement. God is with us. If I fall tomorrow, this movement will not stop. We must love our white brothers. This is what we must do. Please, I implore you, go home. And I heard someone say, God bless you, Reverend King. And they left. Later on that evening, my wife and myself and my child, we were at a friend's house. And I was sitting up in the bed, looking out the window, seeing the street lamp in the distance. And an old feeling came over me. Anger, bitterness, hatred of all white people. What kind of people are these that would bomb a man's home and murder his family? What kind of people are these? And then another voice came to me and said, Martin, you have to understand, these folks were nurtured in a system that was evil. They know nothing else. You do not accept the deed, you hate the deed, and you certainly do your best to destroy that system. But you do not hate them. You hate that system. And that is how my faith, Mr. Cook, has kept me going on this journey. Now, I don't have much time now. I have to get ready for the sermon. But could you do me a favor, Mr. Cook? Remember what I was telling you regarding my father giving me those whippings and things of that nature? If you could you please erase that? Because if my father sees something like that, I think he's going to try to make me become somebody again. If you could do that, I'd appreciate it. And so, again, I'll talk to you tomorrow regarding economics, and hopefully you will stay for the sermon, and that'll give you more insight regarding Vietnam and my views of it. So thank you, Mr. Cook. Thank you. You do well at Morehouse now, and we'll talk tomorrow. Take care. The sermon that I am preaching this morning is not the usual kind of sermon, but it is a sermon and an important subject nevertheless, because the issue that I will be discussing here today is one of the most controversial issues confronting our nation. I am using as a subject from which to preach why I am opposed to the war in Vietnam. Now let me make it clear in the beginning that I see this war as an unjust, evil, and futile war. I'm speaking out on the war in Vietnam today because my conscience leaves me with no other choice. It's time for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. In international conflict, the truth is hard to come by because most nations are deceived about themselves. Rationalizations and the incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataract that blind us to our sins. Yet the day is past for superficial patriotism. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. Freedom is still the bonus we receive for knowing the truth. Ye shall know the truth, says Jesus, and the truth shall set you free. I'm speaking out on the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt. Now, being a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have several major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. At the outset is a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty programs. There were experiments, hopes, and new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I realized that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries to people who are not poor. So I became increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportion relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not yet found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem. And so we were repeatedly faced with a cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that had been unable to seat them together in the same schoolroom. So we watched them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village. We realized that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason moved to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experiences in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I've told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. And their questions hit home. And I realized that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghetto without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government, for the sake of those boys, for the sake of our government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence. I could not be silent. Been a lot of applauding over the last few years. They've applauded our total movement, and they've applauded me. America and most of its newspapers applauded me in Montgomery when I stood before thousands of Negroes getting ready to riot when my home was bombed and said, we can't do it that way. They applauded us in the sit-in movement when we nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the Freedom Ride when we accepted blows without retaliation. They praised us in Albany, in Birmingham, in Selma, Alabama. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise when I was saying, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor. When I was saying, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and the press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press. Now let me tell you the truth about it. Vietnamese people must see Americans as strange liberators. Do you realize that the Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1945 after a combined French and Japanese occupation. And incidentally, this was before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. And this is a little-known fact. These people declared themselves independent in 1945. They quoted our Declaration of Independence in their document of freedom. Yet our government refused to recognize them. President Truman said they were not ready for independence. So we fell victim as a nation at that time of the same deadly arrogance that had poisoned the international situation for all of these years. France then set out to reconquer its former colony. And they fought 8 long, hard, brutal years trying to reconquer Vietnam. You know who helped France? It was the United States of America. Came to the point that we were meeting more than 80% of the war cost. And even when France started despairing of its reckless action, we did not. And in 1954, a conference was called at Geneva, and an agreement was reached because France had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu. But even after that, and even after the Geneva Accord, we did not stop. We must face the sad fact that our government sought, in a real sense, to sabotage the Geneva Accord. Well, after the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, the United States came and started supporting a man named D.M., who turned out to be one of the most ruthless dictators in the history of the world. He set out to silence all opposition. People were brutally murdered merely because they raised their voices against the brutal policies of D.M. The peasants watched and cringed as D.M. ruthlessly rooted out all opposition. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by United States influence and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that D.M.'s message had aroused. When D.M. was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictatorships seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of the people's need for land and peace. And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? But a man by the name of General Keene, who fought with the French against his own people, and who said on one occasion that the greatest hero of his life is Hitler. This is who we're supporting in Vietnam today. Oh, our government and the press generally won't tell us these things, but God told me to tell you this morning. The truth must be told. I am convinced that we ought to get on the right side of the world revolution. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society where machine, computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Finally, let me say this morning that I am speaking out against the Vietnam War because I love America. I speak out against this war not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and with a passionate desire to see our beloved nation stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America. And there can be no great disappointment where there's no great love. I'm disappointed at our inability to act forthrightly and passionately against the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. We are presently headed down a dead-end road which could lead to national disaster. America strayed to the far country of racism and militarism. The home all too many Americans left was solidly structured idealistically. Its pillars were soundly grounded in the insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage. All men are made in the image of God. All men are brothers. All men are created equal. Every man is an heir to a legacy of dignity and worth. Every man has rights which are neither conserved by nor derived from the state. They are God-given. Out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. What a marvelous foundation for any home. What a glorious and healthy place to inhabit. But America strayed away, and this unnatural excursion has brought only confusion and bewilderment. It has left hearts aching with guilt and minds distorted with irrationality. It is time for people of conscience to call upon America to come back home. Come home, America. Omar Khayyam is right, the moving finger right, and having writ moves on. I call on Washington today. I call on every man and woman of goodwill all over America today. I call on the young men of America who must make a choice today. Take a stand on this issue. Tomorrow may be too late. The book may close. And don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nation with judgment, and it seemed that I could hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power, and I'll place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name. You be still and know that I'm God. Now, it isn't easy. Stand up for truth and for justice. Sometimes it means being frustrated. When you tell the truth and take a stand, sometimes it means you walk the streets alone with a burdened heart. Sometimes it means losing a job, means being abused and scorned. It may mean having a 78-year-old child asking your daddy, why do you have to go to jail so much? I've long since learned that to be a follower of Jesus Christ means taking up the cross. My Bible tells me that Good Friday comes before Easter. Before the crown we wear, there is the cross that we must bear. Let us bear it for truth, bear it for justice, and bear it for peace. And let us go out this morning with that determination. And I have not lost faith. I'm not in despair, because I know that there is a moral order. I haven't lost faith, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I can still sing, we shall overcome, because Carlyle was right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant was right. Truth crushed the earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell was right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to go out and transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we'll be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. With this faith, we'll be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and every man will stand under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid, because the words of the Lord have spoken it. With this faith, we'll be able to speed up the day when all over the world will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. With this faith, we'll sing it as we're getting ready to sing it now. Men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nations will not rise up against nations, neither shall they study war anymore. And I don't know about you. I ain't going to study war no more. Thank you. Now, there may be some questions that some folks may have regarding various things, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. Are there any questions that anyone has? Any questions? Yes.
Is that the Riverside Church?
Yes, this particular speech, I gave a variation of it. The initial speech was called Beyond Vietnam, which was at Riverside. That was on April the 4th. 1967. This is, this being April 30th, this is a variation of that, why I opposed the Vietnam War. So it's the same speech, but it's a little different. It's more of a sermon, so to speak. Yes?
Sir, I grew up in Birmingham. March with King Jr. I've heard the sermons for 50 years. I've heard the playing, singing, and marching. And maybe I want to ask you, in your opinion, if you could fast forward to 50 years, from then to now, have we made the progress that Dr. King would expect?
Well, I'm not able to. The gentleman wanted to know if I could fast forward 50 years. I can't do that. Right now, it's enough being in 1967. I would like to think, if the question has to do with where do I think we will go from here, well, I wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And it'll either be chaos or it'll be community. Right now, I see very dark days. I haven't given up hope, but I see dark days, and it's going to require us to look deeply into ourselves. It's going to require us to look to each other and see each other as brothers and sisters. It's going to require us to tell the truth about who we are, and from that truth, gain a certain strength in order for us to survive what I see happening now in 1967. But right now, I have to admit, it looks very dark, and if we don't respond, I'm trying to get the nation to respond to nonviolence. If they don't respond, I don't know what will happen.
And keeping with that, sir, if we don't change what we've been doing for the last 50 years, or add to it or something from it, can we expect the same thing to happen for the next 50 years?
Perhaps even what the gentleman wanted to know, if we don't change, can we expect the same? Yes, if not worse. I'm fearing a cataclysm happening. I mean, we've already seen what happened in '65 with Watts. We saw what happened in Newark. We saw what happened in Detroit. So we have some work to do.
What would you suggest?
Well, the first thing I would say for us to do is to be honest with one another, is to work together. I would say the issue now, besides racism, which seems to be a constant, is income inequality. And I'm trying to get people to join this Poor People campaign so we can go to Washington, D.C., and demand that this country change its economic policy. Guaranteed income for poor people, guaranteed housing, guaranteed jobs. These are the things that we need. You see, it didn't cost this nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost this nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we're talking about issues that cannot be solved without this nation willing to spend billions of dollars to end poverty in this nation and to hopefully through that end poverty in the world. So I would say the first thing people need to do is join me in this Poor People campaign.
Sir, actually, I'm just going to open up the floor a little bit. You have a question?
Yes, I'm interested in the reaction of the congregation when you delivered that sermon.
You mean your reaction to being part of the congregation?
The reaction of the congregation to your sermon at that time.
Well, right now, you are the congregation.
Yes. So what is your reaction?
You are the congregation. So hopefully the reaction was something positive.
Well, what about you said there were excerpts of this speech that you gave in
Oh,
a
you
previous
mean
speech.
the Beyond Vietnam?
Yes.
Well, now the reaction to that particular speech was not good. Now, the people who were there, they enjoyed the speech, but the newspapers basically made me out to be a pariah. In essence, they basically said that I had no business talking about international issues. I should stick to civil rights. And so there's been a lot of controversy regarding that. And so that was not good. Now, in this sermon, you heard me say that I thought it was hypocritical for them to talk about, well, I'm talking about nonviolence as it relates to Bull Connor and Jim Clark. When I talk about nonviolence as it relates to those little children in Vietnam, all of a sudden I am cursed and damned. So that was me responding in some ways to what happened on April the 4th, 1967 at Riverside. Okay. Anyone else?
Yes, sir.
I know the Bible says that they held all things in common, and as you're talking about income inequality, that you're alluding to that. Aren't you afraid of being branded a communist?
Well, the gentleman wanted to know, am I afraid of being branded a communist? I've already been branded a communist sympathizer, a dupe, all of these things. But when one is presumed a leader, you have to not follow consensus. You have to mold consensus. I can't concern myself with how people are going to view me at this stage. We're in a very, very dangerous period. So if they want to brand me a communist, fine. If they want to call me a communist sympathizer or a dupe, fine. I know I'm not a communist. There would be no way I could be a communist. But I do know that income inequality in this nation is destroying this nation. I do know that Negro people who worked for 246 years and after Reconstruction was said, okay, now we have segregation, and so this income gap that's widening, I know they need help. They need a sharing of the power and a sharing of the wealth they help to build. But I don't want to stop there. There are poor whites who need help. And American Indians who need help, and Puerto Ricans on the east, and the Mexicans of the west. All of these people need help because all of these people create and make up the fabric of what we call America. And if America is going to be the nation that it professes to be, it has to do something. So I'm not concerned about being called a communist at this time. Yes?
But why do you say that it's not possible for you to be a communist? Yeah.
Well, because I'm not. I'm a preacher. I could not be, there could be no way I could be a communist. I certainly don't believe in the ethical relativism, the whole concept of the end justifies the end justifies the means, if I'm saying that correctly. Because in my mind, the end is pre-existent in the means. And so if you're going to lie and cheat and steal and murder, thinking that this will somehow bring about a just end, you're living in illusion. So that's a communist concept that I simply could not follow. Now, I do have respect for Marx in regard to his flame for social passion. I just think he got caught up in this materialistic and ethical relativism. And I do believe that communism is a judgment on our failure to make democracy real. Communism is a judgment on our failure to make Christianity real. I'm merely speaking the gospel as I read and I studied in the Bible. You know, I suppose one could say Jesus was a communist as well, if that's the case. Jesus was with the poor. He threw out the money changers. He turned water into wine. He made loaves of bread to feed the multitude. So that would fit the definition, I suppose, of being a communist. And if they want to call Jesus a communist, then I will stand with Jesus. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yes.
I just want to suggest that perhaps one of the ingredients that's missing in all of the stuff we've been doing for the last 50 years is getting involved in the community, in the local politics. And I know the church sometimes says you got to separate the two. But if we don't, as poor people, don't get involved in voting and electing people to the office that controls the power, we will still be singing the same song 50 years from now.
Well, sir, as you know, the gentleman was making a statement saying that we need to get involved in politics. Well, that's been my mission. That's been what I've been doing. That's what the Voting Rights Act was about. Because I figure that if we get the politics and the ability to vote, then we can vote out, and some change has happened. But the struggle continues. So yes, I mean, that's certainly one of the legs that has to be dealt with as it relates to making our lives better, without a doubt. That's been my struggle. Anyone else? Well, I'd like to thank all of those for your questions, and please join the Poor People campaign. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Marvin Jefferson. Marvin is an actor who teaches at the Bloomfield College in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. He has performed at the annual Great Plains Chautauqua in West Fargo, North Dakota, and Colorado, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, and Nevada Chautauqua festivals. So we'll open up the floor for questions to Mr. Jefferson.
Okay, anybody have any questions for me about Dr. King? Yes, sir.
I can't quite tell from your background where you were raised. And I'd be interested in what in your life took you in this direction.
Good question. Well, you know, first off, I want to say this. My brother, Steve Jefferson, is back there. He came here specifically because he lives in this area. And yeah, give him a hand. Because if we're talking about background, he's a big part of that. Matter of fact, October 17th, he's going to be inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. I just want everybody to know that. So, yeah, okay. Well, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I was born and raised there. And interestingly enough, my grandfather knew Malcolm. My grandfather was there when Malcolm was assassinated. That's right, he was at the Audubon. There's some film footage showing my grandfather there, after, documentary footage. My grandfather was there. He came back and told the family what happened. So my grandfather knew him. He spoke with Malcolm perhaps a day or so before he was assassinated. So there is that connection. My family is an artistic one. I don't know if we have any jazz people here, but my family, my Uncle Andy Bay, is a jazz singer. My aunt, Salome Bay, and Geraldine DeHaas, and I have a lot of family who are in the arts. And so I would say somehow that kind of rubbed off on me. That and my Aunt Florence, who was a teacher, was an educator. So for me, college was about education and theater. And that's kind of what led me to acting. Now, what led me to Chautauqua? A gentleman by the name of Giles Wright, who passed away a few years ago. In 1997, Giles asked me, Marvin, would you like to do the ropes in Chautauqua? And I said, what? Because I didn't know what Chautauqua meant. I had no idea. And he told me what it was. And because they wanted to do something special for Paul Robeson, because that was the first person I portrayed, and I continue to portray him, because he was born in 1898, which is the same date that I think the library was created in 1898, and so his centennial was 1998. So they wanted me to portray him in the Chautauqua format. So that is what introduced me to Chautauqua, and I flew out to West Fargo, North Dakota. Saw a lot of mosquitoes, which was really weird. And it was Charles Pace. If Charles is here, I don't know if he's still here or not. There he is. He was one of the, Chautauquans who I met when I was starting out. And Charles had been doing it for many years. And Charles told me, Marvin, if you keep doing Chautauqua, it will change your life. And 17 years later, he was absolutely correct. So yeah, that's how I started. That's how that started. Yes.
In your studies of Dr. King, what do you think you would be most focused on during these days?
The gentleman wanted to know, given my studies of Dr. King, what would Dr. King be most focused on given these days? Oh, a lot of the same, unfortunately. I mean, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, so we'd have to shore that up. We have the Black Lives Matter campaign, because of the criminal justice system and the disproportionate way in which African Americans and other people of color are being treated. Certainly income inequality is a big deal. So same as it ever was. That would be his focus. Certainly, I mean, if we look at the trajectory of where Dr. King was headed, income inequality was a big deal. And what he planned to do with the Poor People's Campaign was basically to shut Washington, D.C. down and basically stay there and demand that this country change its economic policy, which is very radical then and now. So given that trajectory, of course we can never know actually, but given that trajectory, that's where he would be headed. And he would be trying to maintain what we won and trying to gain what we need to get. That's what I think will be happening now. Yes?
So how does the study and the portrayal of Dr. King?
There's a saying that she wanted to know how has the portrayal of Dr. King changed my life, or Paul Robeson for that matter. There's a saying that Frederick Douglass, and I know Charles, you know this, what a man works on him as well. A man may carve out his circumstances, but his circumstances carve him out as well. When you work on something constantly, it changes you in ways that you may not even realize. I do not in any way, shape, or form claim to be near Dr. King or Paul Robeson or any of that. But when you deal with people like this and you're constantly invoking their lives, it does affect you. And I would say because they are such wonderful human beings, it affects you in a very positive way. So yeah, there is some effect. I can't tell you how, whatever, but it's certainly an awareness, you know, an awareness of people and a compassion and a certain dignity that they carry themselves with. So yeah, all of that. Anyone else? Any other question? Yes.
How would you see Dr. King applying nonviolence today in our struggle with ISIS?
Interesting. That's a good question. Dr. King was a pacifist, but he was not, as he called himself, an arrogant pacifist. He understood the dilemma of the non-pacifist, and he understood that sometimes war is a necessary evil. It is an evil, but it is a necessary evil. It was certainly necessary when dealing with someone like Hitler. But Dr. King would still hold fast that in this world where people have nuclear weapons that can blow folks off the face of the map, for Dr. King would be either nonviolence or non-existent. So he would still be the one crying and calling for nonviolence if everybody else said, you know, we have to do this. He would understand, you know, about ISIS, but he would also ask the hard questions. What do I mean by that? How did ISIS come to be? What did America have to do with ISIS coming to be? You know, what did America have to do with Al-Qaeda? Are there any connections between American business people and Al-Qaeda? See, Dr. King would ask the hard questions and ask America to answer those hard questions. So he may say, yeah, okay, you may need to do this, but let's keep this in mind, you know, because he was very politically astute in that way. So yeah, he would understand it, but he would still be against war. I mean, he was a pacifist. That's what he was. And he never wavered from that. Anyone else? Thank you, brother. Oh, yes.
I wonder what Dr. King would think of somebody like Al Sharpton.
Well, Dr. King, it's interesting. One gentleman wanted to know what would Dr. King think of someone like Al Sharpton. And Dr. King would acknowledge what Al Sharpton has done in regard to bringing attention. He was not a person to, you know, nitpick and say, well, you know, he's this and he's that. A lot of people did that with him. He may say so privately. I mean, he had problems with Jesse Jackson back in the day because he saw Jesse as someone ambitious. And he saw that as something very dangerous. Jesse was like kind of like out for himself. But he would never put him down in public. It would always be a private thing. And I would say it would be the same with Al Sharpton. He would appreciate what Al Sharpton is doing, and anybody who's fighting for, you know, but I mean, privately, he may have his own issues, and he may pull them to the side, certainly. But he would never denigrate him publicly. He just wouldn't do that. That's just not the way he is. Yes?
Is there a character who tempts you? somebody that, you probably don't have the time to go towards, but you're willing to take on?
Let's see. Robeson, which was big. King, which is huge. I do York, who was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jack Johnson, maybe. Booker T. Washington, perhaps. I don't know. Those two. Someone even mentioned Louis Armstrong. I just can't get around that horn. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to know a little bit about the horn, and I simply don't, But yeah, but I would say those two certainly are in the wind. Oh, a gentleman by the name of, I'm probably too old for it now, a gentleman by the name of Bass Reeves. A lot of people don't know who Bass Reeves is, but Bass Reeves was perhaps, in his day, the greatest lawman in the West. The myth of the Lone Ranger was based on him, but a lot of people don't know who he is, and his story is incredible. So that's somebody. But I don't have the hair, and I don't, and all kinds of stuff. I don't have the hair for King, but I could kind of maneuver that, but that's a whole other thing. Anyone else? Yes.
I have okay, so what would you personally recommend for a young adult who, in today's society, who is looking to invoke change? What would you personally recommend as a step?
What would I recommend for a young person who wants to invoke change? Okay. I would say the first thing, if that young person hasn't done so already, is to study history. Become a student of history, because I submit to you that the answers to the problems that we face are in the pages of history. They are there. We've had brilliant people saying all kinds of things. The problem is people fall into these old habits and they keep doing the same thing over and over again, as opposed to listening to the person, the man or woman, saying, hey, if you try this, maybe that won't happen. So I would say that first, study history. Study history, be a history junkie. That would be the first thing. It's hard for someone to say, well, what should you do? Because you have to follow your own conscience. But I would say the first thing, and I tell my students that study history. Study, learn what the game is. Because there's games being played on people, the game of race, the game of class, the game of gender. These games are being played, and when you study history, you're able to see it in action. And then you'll be able to say, okay, we can stop this. Or, okay, I see. You understand what I mean? Learn what the game is. The only way to learn the game is to study history. That's what I would say. Make a long. Yes.
In relation to that, I find it difficult to find reliable and credible history. Like, I understand that there is, tons of history that one can learn from. However, what do you recommend personally?
Oh, in person?
Yeah, me personally. What I mean by that is I've taken to learning my history as of recently through autobiographies, by learning a person's story, and through their story you learn of sort of their time and seeing it in their eyes.
A person whose history is someone, I believe Charles mentioned Ella Baker. That's someone who has that's a great person to learn about. Fannie Lou Hamer, that's another great person to learn about. Right there you have a whole wealth of stuff, because Ella Baker was really the architect for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At one point in time, she was a member of SCLC, but because of the patriarchy that was going on, that King himself practiced, she left. And also, she had a problem with charismatic leadership, of which King was obviously a part of, because the whole concept with her was everybody, the collective, had to be a part of what they were going to do. So she was instrumental. She called herself someone who was how can I put it? She was an advisor, but she really was one of the architects for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker was a great woman, and that's a great person to know about. So I would say look at her strongly, because she doesn't get enough credit as far as I'm concerned. Neither does Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer got a little notoriety more so because she did that famous thing at the 1964 convention, and although Johnson cut it off before she got a chance to really speak. But her story is extraordinary too. But I would check out Ella Baker. Check her out. Yeah, yeah. I know it's getting late. So folks, thank you very much for coming, and give yourself a round of applause. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for attending this year's Chautauqua. I'd like to thank our wonderful performers, Stu Fuchs, Charles Everett Pace, and Marvin Jefferson. A lot of different organizations helped us with grants and fundings. We announced their names at the beginning of the evening, but I'd like to thank the New Hampshire Humanities Council for their support, and to point you in our program with the logos of all our contributing agencies. Finally, I ask you to please take a moment to fill out our evaluation forms. We use them as we plan for future programs. And if you are interested in joining our email list, please provide your name and email address on the evaluation forms. We'll add you to our weekly emails, and you'll be notified of future programs. Thank you, and have a good evening.